Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Minna. I'm one of the associate medical directors in the Department of Pathology at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where I help to oversee molecular virology diagnostics, including coronavirus testing. I'm also an assistant professor of epidemiology and of immunology at the Harvard School of Public Health, where I have a lab that generally studies infectious diseases, how they transmit through populations, and also I study how to interpret the immunological response to pathogens and use that as a tool to monitor and track outbreaks. So today I'm going to be talking about a pretty wide array of topics surrounding COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. I'll start by giving some appreciation of the epidemiology of the virus from when it emerged in China to today. I'll also talk quite a bit about diagnostics, and I'll tell a little bit of the background about what happened with sort of the diagnostic failures early on in this epidemic. And then I'll finish by talking a little bit about surveillance efforts and what we really need to do moving forward to keep the community safe. So just as some disclosures, I have received consulting fees from various diagnostic companies, and I will be discussing some diagnostics. But I don't believe that any of these have influenced the talk that I'll be giving today. So I've already given you a bit of the outline of the talk. Again, I'll be discussing some of the epidemiology, some of the testing blunders that happened in the US in particular, and then I'll give more information on sort of the way that we test for this virus and how we survey for it. So to give a little bit of background, if we go back to when this virus emerged, which now it really feels like years ago, at least in my world, but really it was only in December that the world recognized that this virus was circulating, and that was in a seafood market in Wuhan, in the Hubei province of China. And the reason I want to show this graph here is because just the extraordinary speed, both that the virus began transmitting, but more to the point with this particular graph is the speed at which the community and the Chinese government responded to dealing with this virus. And so it was really only first detected on December 8th. But within a month from the moment of first detection, the virus had been sequenced, the genomes had been released to the public into the public domain, and PCR testing had already become available in China. So it was really this extraordinary speed going from first detection, sequencing the full genome, releasing that, and making the data available publicly. This was very in all aspects. This was an unprecedented uh, pace to do all of this, and it was really quite impressive. And in the same way as the response was impressive, what was also very impressive was just how quickly this virus began to spread. And so it was, of course, observed in the seafood market, but quickly began spreading in Wuhan, which is a very large city. And very rapidly, though, it spread outside of Wuhan and outside of the Hubei province and to the rest of China and then to neighboring countries. So it became very apparent very early, really in January, that this was, for at least epidemiologists like myself who study these viruses, it became apparent that this was a pathogen that was very likely going to become a global pandemic. And of course, now we know that is exactly what happened. So to place this virus in a bit of context with other viruses, we can look at where it falls, both in terms of how transmissible it is, which I'm showing on the x-axis, and how fatal it is. How many people does it kill per infected individual on the y-axis? So this slide or this graphic comes from the New York Times, and it's a bit old, but I think it's an extraordinary graphic. So on the x-axis is the R naught. That's essentially the basic reproductive number of the virus, which means how many people, for every one person who's infected in a totally susceptible population, how many people go on to get infected from that individual. We see, for example, measles has an R naught of 15 out here on the right side. And the common cold and seasonal flu, they're around an R naught of 1.5 or 2. So we believe that SARS-CoV-2 lives around this area of 2 to 3. For every person who gets infected with SARS-CoV-2, they might go on to infect another 2 to 3 individuals, assuming everyone's susceptible still. In terms of the fatality rate, this virus, this again came from back in February, and there's a lot of uncertainty about just how fatal this is. And we know that it scales very much with age. I'll come back to that. But essentially, in terms of where this virus fits, this is not the most transmissible virus, and it's also not the most fatal nor symptomatic virus, which actually makes it a very scary virus to control. If it showed a lot of symptoms, then we'd be able to control it better, like Ebola. We would know who's infected when they do get infected. And if it's not very transmissible, then we wouldn't have to worry about it spreading so fast. But here we have a virus that is both moderately transmissible and moderately symptomatic and fatal. And that is actually kind of a perfect storm that allows a virus to spread very quickly throughout a population, potentially without being noticed. So to look at the severity of this virus, we have probably all read and heard about just that it's more severe and more fatal in the elderly. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, on the left side here, this is the fraction of people who are actually getting infected. So we see that there's a very large fraction of people who are getting infected who are younger, and it's actually a pretty small number of the 70, 80, and 90-year-olds in terms of the overall population who is getting infected. This is back from Wuhan. But amongst that small fraction of people, they're actually counting for a very high fraction of the overall deaths associated with this virus. And we know also that things like cancer and hypertension and cardiovascular disease are increasing the fatality rate associated with this virus. So it's a virus that even that a relatively small number of people of infections are resulting in a very large fraction of the overall mortality associated with it. And as of today, the average mortality rate at the population level is estimated to be somewhere around 0.5 or 1%. But as you can see here, it changes drastically over time with individuals over 80 years old potentially having a 15% chance of mortality. So if we take some data from the United States and we actually break it down to, we use data that is where we set the denominator based on seroprevalence studies. That means we're taking the rate based on the number of deaths per people we actually think were infected, regardless of whether they were ever found to be positive on PCR. And so what we see with that is when we do that analysis, we actually see that for people under 64 years old, the average mortality rate is actually very, very low. And the difference between the blue bars and the orange here is that the blue bar is the average fatality rate in that particular group. The orange is the cumulative mortality rate for everyone in that group and younger. So we see actually that it's a very low mortality, even up to 45 years of age. And it starts to increase pretty significantly after that, but certainly after 65 years of age, we start seeing 3%, if not 8% mortality based on when the denominator is true infections. And in New York City, for example, it was around 20% of the population was infected on average. And so for people under 65 years of age, though, that actually reflects around 88% of New York City is under 65 years of age. So actually, the majority of New York City falls in this very low mortality group, whereas the majority of deaths are really happening in a very small fraction. So if we look at how cases are distributed, this is data from China. We see that deaths make up a fairly small fraction, of course, and then of people who are being found to be positive, we see that the majority are actually mild cases. Now, what is not captured in the data I'm showing right here is the actual number of totally asymptomatic people, or people who didn't know they had coronavirus, but who were then found to be positive based on serological data. And that actually is a much larger group of individuals. So this is to drive home the point that there are a lot of people who don't have any symptoms from this virus, and that makes this a very difficult virus to contain. But we have methods to contain it, and actually masks can do a tremendous amount of good to stop transmission of this virus. And in particular, if two people both are wearing masks, both the person who might be sick and the person who doesn't want to get sick, then you can actually really reduce transmission considerably, perhaps as much as 80 or 90%. So these small things that a mask is not going to have any adverse side effects for most people, and it's really a simple way that we can all work together to prevent transmission. And but this is in I think that there's been a lot of confusion around the use of masks, although I hope that the tides are changing now. And this was a tweet from back in February when the U.S. Surgeon General and the U.S. CDC were actually telling people not to wear masks. And this, I think, was unfortunately a mistake on their part, and it led to a lot of confusion. They were suggesting people not wear masks because they didn't want, they wanted to make sure that there were enough masks for medical professionals. But in general, it led to just a tremendous amount of confusion. And I would highly recommend mask wearing as a good way to prevent transmission. So it's an interesting virus. It has a lot of the way that it transmits in the population is very heterogeneous. You see some areas that have very high infection rates, and some areas that are very low and really not infected at all. In New York City, over here on the left, you see that at the population level, as much as 20 or new estimates might go up to 30% of individuals have been found to be seropositive, meaning they have antibodies and evidence of exposure to this virus. But then in the rest of New York State, outside of New York City, at the time, the seroprevalence was only 3.6%. Here in Massachusetts, you can see this very heterogeneous distribution where some of the counties are very dark red, meaning they had a lot of cases, and some are less. And so in general, it's very heterogeneous at the population level. It's also very heterogeneous in terms of how it transmits at the individual sort of family unit and workplace level. And the reason I bring it up here is because actually the most recent evidence suggests that the heterogeneous nature of how this virus transmits and sort of the way that it transmits, particularly through certain groups and not through others, can actually serve to help us in the long run. The fact that it spreads very, very heterogeneously could actually reduce the level that we need to achieve, the levels of infections we need to achieve to get to herd immunity. And so over here, if we look on this rightmost column, in general, theoretically, we should assume that herd immunity will only be reached once we reach about 66% of the population infected. But when the authors of this study accounted for the heterogeneous transmission, and I won't go into details of the modeling, they found that actually herd immunity might be achieved with just 50% of the population infected. And if this turns out to be an R naught of only 2, then you might actually achieve herd immunity at only 34% of the population. So we don't believe that it's an R naught of 2. It's probably more like 3 or 4 in a lot of places. But regardless, heterogeneity in terms of transmission can actually benefit the outlook. So to shift gears a little bit and move to testing, there was a lot in the media, and probably a lot of you had never even thought about testing before this virus. I point this slide out. This is what the test looked like that the CDC first put out. And so right after this virus sort of took hold in China and then in the rest of the world, the WHO, the World Health Organization, came out with a PCR test. I don't need to go into the details, but it targets 3 different genes on the coronavirus, and you take a swab, and you from that swab you look for the virus RNA using this test. The assay was working very well, actually. It was in much of the world, but the U.S. Decided to go a different route from the WHO version of the assay, and they developed their own assay, which also targeted 3 parts of the virus, all on a single gene, on the nucleocapsid gene. And the interesting thing here was that the CDC spent a while to really develop the test. And then on February 6th, they sent the test out with a lot of fanfare to state laboratories. Unfortunately, it was already not sufficient. I think from any epidemiological approach, it was very clear that the numbers of tests that they had sent out to the state laboratories was going to be woefully insufficient. But what ended up happening was far worse, and they actually had to recall all of the tests. And it wasn't actually until almost a month later that the CDC was able to get a new version of the test out later on. And it turned out that it was actually a contaminant in the assay. The assay was actually working well, but unfortunately, some of the tubes were contaminated at the CDC facility, and that led to a full month-long delay in testing. And so it really hampered the U.S.'s ability to see this virus as it was spreading kind of unabated in the U.S. In particular, more recent evidence suggests that 20,000 people in New York City might have been infected before the test was even introduced there. So throughout all of February, there were only hundreds of tests, not thousands, and certainly not millions of tests that had been run in the United States. And that left us in the early part of this epidemic. You can see here that the test per million in the US was really far behind and lagging almost every other peer country that we have. So we certainly, it wasn't a time when we were shining as a country. And that is sort of a story that has continued, unfortunately. A different interesting thing happened where the CDC declared as a public health emergency regarding this test or regarding this virus. But what that did was that actually put in place an immediate need for an emergency use authorization for testing to be performed. And this requirement of what now we've probably all heard of what is an EUA, the requirement for an EUA or emergency use authorization essentially took the ability out of individual laboratories like ours at Brigham and Women's Hospital, took it away from us, and sort of all tests had to be approved first by the FDA. That's very different than how things normally work, which is if a laboratory like Brigham wants to develop a test, say for flu or prostate cancer or something like that, we actually have wide latitude to develop our own tests and use them for our own patients without going to the FDA. The EUA requirements essentially put a halt to that and said, if you want to test even any of your own patients, you have to get approval from the FDA first. And that actually handcuffed many labs. As a medical director, it left us feeling really helpless to deal with our patients appropriately. And I think that this is a learning lesson for the country that in a rapidly moving pandemic, we have to be very careful not to mistakenly hamper testing that is needed. In this case, the EUA approval process was really to ensure the quality of the test, but it ultimately ended up harming our ability to test people. Uh, so that was sort of all through February, and in the process, despite feeling very handcuffed, we kind of looked forward and recognized that it wasn't going to be the FDA. There was no way they were going to keep restricting the testing, and so at Brigham, with the microbiology lab where I'm based, and then with the Center for Advanced Molecular Diagnostics at Brigham, we actually collaborated and created an in-house test that could be used and is largely now being used today at Brigham. And we were able to get that out by March to start testing patients. So I just want to show if anyone's interested, this is what the instrument looks like that the CDC recommends is used, or that the CDC protocol was using. Now, the only reason I want to point this out is to show that this isn't exactly a very high throughput instrument. It's a small instrument. It's a PCR test, goes into that and comes out the other side essentially, and you can do anywhere from 30 to 90 tests at a time. But it's really not, it's very manual and not really appropriate for testing large groups of people for surveillance. So that led to some difficulties getting enough tests out to people. This is what different tests look like that we normally use. These are some of the big players in the testing world. That you'll see these instruments in the clinical microbiology labs if you come to Brigham or go to Mass General, for example. And so there's different types of tests. The two on the bottom are sort of the workhorses of many microbiology labs today in hospitals, and they can process a lot of samples very quickly. and they are very, very accurate. We're also seeing a new emergence of these rapid tests like Cepheid and Abbott and Quidel. These are sort of the three of the leaders right now for rapid point of care testing, and they're very easy to use. You just take a swab out of somebody, you put it into one of these tests, essentially hit a button and go. And so this is what these kinds of assays are really what microbiology labs today are more used to using, and some of these assays are actually starting to be able to be used in supermarkets or in drive-through testing right there in a parking lot. So they can be very valuable and add a lot to surveillance efforts. As we look forward to what testing might look like, we're going to start seeing sort of what I call pregnancy test model versions of these tests. And these are going to be very cheap, very rapid tests that you might be able to have buy a kit of 100 of them and just have them in your house. And if you think you're not feeling well, you use it the same way you might use a thermometer, for example. And and so I think that we should anticipate seeing a lot of these come about in the near future over the next few months. We should we should see these on the market. So moving to antibody testing, there was a lot of confusion around antibody testing, and the CNN actually had this headline saying antibody tests for COVID-19 are wrong up to half the time, CDC says. Unfortunately, there was just so much confusion that they let this story go. CDC did not say this. What CNN was referring to is actually on CDC's webpage. They have a hypothetical example of a low accuracy test, but it's just a purely hypothetical example to describe sort of some metrics that people should be looking out for tests. And unfortunately, CNN and many, many others after this misinterpreted this headline and thought that the CDC was actually saying that the antibody tests are very inaccurate and mistakenly took the hypothetical example to be a real sort of data set. But it was not. And I think that it's just to point out, there's just been so much confusion about antibody tests. But in reality, antibody tests today are now becoming very accurate for this virus. Roche and Abbott and PerkinElmer, and including some of the tests that we're developing here at Harvard and at MGH and Brigham, these tests can be very specific, over 99.4% specific, and almost 100% sensitive after somebody's been infected for a couple of weeks. So these tests are really very powerful tools, and their accuracy is actually very high at this point. Of course, where there is some interesting data, which is a little bit concerning. It's not surprising, but concerning nonetheless, which is that mild cases of coronavirus seem to be having antibody responses that, while they do develop antibody responses, they seem to be waning pretty quickly. This is not surprising. This is actually, as an immunologist who normally studies infections in children when they're getting their first infection, this is actually pretty common. What we're also seeing, though, is that the most severe cases, they are developing antibody responses that seem to uh, send off very high titer antibodies, which we expect will probably persist for months, if not years, in individuals. And that's important because it can be used for surveillance as a very powerful tool. So to give a little sense of what I think about what keeps me up at night, uh, and why we need to really get surveillance and control measures in place. While this is Massachusetts as of a couple days ago, we've seen a declining rate of cases. Of course, across the country, we're now seeing a worrying increase in cases. And this is all has to be prefaced with the fact that all of these increases in cases today are actually happening in the summertime. And if you look to these graphs at the right, coronavirus is a very seasonal virus. And June, July, and August, which is where we're at now, these are usually the lowest times for coronavirus transmission. And usually October, November is when coronaviruses rapidly spread throughout populations, and at least in the northern hemisphere. And so we have to be very careful. We have to wear masks, as we move forward. And this is just a picture of a lot of people not wearing masks and crowded together recently in the midst of this outbreak. And I'm very concerned that in the fall, we're going to, unfortunately, probably see much wider transmission if we're not careful. So there's different ways that we can survey for the virus. We can perform viral testing, which everyone's probably become familiar with. Many of you have probably gotten a test. Or we can use antibody testing, which is we often refer to it as serology. But viral testing, that's really to test for the virus right here and now. It's to say, are you infected currently? But then after a couple of weeks or less, the virus signal disappears often because as people recover, and then the antibodies come up in that same period of time. But then the nice thing is that antibodies will stay for long periods of time. So that makes it potentially a very useful tool for surveillance because it's a signal that persists rather than going away and then you miss people. To give an example of what that looks like, if we picture each column here as a week in time and each row is a person, and what I'm showing over here is red is when individuals, each of these people are potentially positive for the virus. Well, this is a very transient virus. So if you're just doing random surveillance of the population for the virus, you might take a whole slice in time, say if you test everyone this week, and find that there are no cases happening around you. But if you go over and you look at antibody tests, which once they become positive, they persist as positive for long periods of time, if you take a slice in time here, you'd be able to see that there are many people who have been exposed to this virus, and you'd even be able to use different techniques looking at different types of antibodies, in particular IgM antibodies, to say that some people have been infected very recently. So this makes antibody testing a very powerful tool for sort of long-term surveillance. And as we look into 2021 and 2022, I think we should plan on seeing antibody testing becoming much more useful. So so it raises the question: is PCR testing enough? Everyone's been focused on it, or does antibody add something, or serology add something? Well, this is just one example. If we go into, let's say that we're in a nursing home, I think of virus testing sort of like looking at a storm here and now. If we go into a nursing home and we look at who's positive for the virus, it kind of tells us that, okay, in this example, that there's 5 people in this 5% of the nursing home is positive right here and now, and we need to be taking appropriate action. But what is that action? We don't actually know. Is the epidemic on its way down or is it on its way up? And so we don't have the correct information about the epidemic trajectory of the virus. If, on the other hand, we add serology into the mix, antibody testing, then all of a sudden we get a much clearer picture of what we need to do. If in that same nursing home we go in and we say 55% of people are antibody positive, then in that community, if you find 5% of people have the virus, you can know that the outbreak is likely on its way down. If, on the other hand, 6% of people have antibodies and 5% of people are positive with the virus, then that's when you throw in all of the PCR testing you can, all the virus testing, you start wearing lots of PPE because that outbreak is about to take off in that community and you need to preempt it and get it under control. So antibody testing can work in concert very well with PCR testing. So, with virus testing, there's been a lot of focus on the sensitivity of tests. You may have heard false negatives, false positives. Well, the sensitivity of a test is how likely, if you have the infection, are you to actually detect it? Um, and so there's been so much scrutiny on getting sensitive tests that I worry that that we're kind of sort of missing the forest for the trees. And what we're doing is we're paying so much attention on only sensitive tests that we might not be getting some of the really rapid, cheaper tests out as quickly as we could. And so the question that I'll pose is, what if you had a very low cost and rapid test, but it was very poorly sensitive? It didn't detect all the cases you might want it to in terms of the viral loads. So if a test only would turn positive if you had 100,000 RNA copies versus 1,000 RNA copies, would you want to use that test for surveillance? Well, a lot of people would right off the bat say no. I want the most sensitive test. But if you think about it for surveillance efforts, that might not be the whole story. And we looked at this. And the reason I say that is if we actually look at the kinetics of the virus, what does the virus do inside of a person when it starts growing? Well, it turns out you have a few days after you get infected. What I'm showing here on the y axis is sort of the virus titer. And then on the x-axis is days since infection. And if we ask the question, we have a very high sensitivity test, meaning this one that picks up around 10 viral copies per milliliter, and this one that picks up 1,000 viral copies per milliliter. So 1,000 sounds worse than 10 as your limit of detection. But it turns out that once the virus really starts growing, it grows exponentially. And so that means the amount of time that on the upslope of the virus infecting a person, the amount of time that you're actually in between these two tests where you'd be detecting with the high sensitivity test and not detecting with the low sensitivity test is actually a very short amount of time. It's on the order of hours, maybe a day max. Uh, and then right after you pass this threshold, most of your transmissive time as a transmitting person is actually detectable with both tests. And so what we're finding though is that after a while, once that virus starts to get cleared from an individual, the infectious virus is no longer there, but you still get copies of the virus RNA that exist in the body. And these tests, because they detect RNA, they're not detecting live virus per se, but they're detecting viral genomes. We actually can still detect the virus RNA well after the transmissible virus has disappeared from the body. And it turns out that as we go back down, as those viral RNA copies get cleared from the body, it turns out you get to another period of time when the high sensitivity test is able to detect the individual viral RNA copies, but the low sensitivity test doesn't. I show that in the yellow portion of time here. These, I would argue that for surveillance, these individuals, finding them is actually not very important because they're not transmitting virus. So we maybe have a trade-off that we can work with, whereas we don't lose a lot by having a less sensitive test in terms of detecting transmitting people. But we might, but if we, so that allows us room to maybe develop quicker tests, even if they're not quite as sensitive. But we wanted to ask the question, would this make a difference for surveillance? And so we did that. And what I'm showing here is the output of some mathematical models that I'm not going to go into detail about how they work. But essentially, what we found is that much more so than the limits of detection or the sensitivity of the test, which I'm showing by the two matched bars on each of these, is actually the frequency with which you test people. And the frequency is actually very much what drives how well you can control outbreaks. So what I'm showing on the x-axis here is how much of the infectiousness can you remove from the population if you're testing at different intervals with these different tests. So if you're testing daily, you remove practically 100% of all infected people, maybe even before they become infectious, on both of these assays overall. And it's the frequency, how frequently you're testing. Is it every 14 days or every week? That really makes the big difference. And if we look over here at the overall incidence that's associated with the infection, if you don't test at all, you have 100% this is sort of relative to the no test scenario. But if we test daily or every 3 days, or even weekly, we still do a very good job with both tests at really reducing incidence, particularly in the daily and 3 day. So the test quality itself doesn't matter as much as frequency. And there's one other piece, which is it's not just the test frequency or the limit of detection, but it's how quickly do you get results returned back. The speed at which you get a test result back matters for isolating people quickly. And so what we found is actually it's very important. If you can give a rapid result back in minutes, that's much better than giving a result back in a day or 2 days. And that's what I'm showing in each of these scenarios. So there's really not too much difference between the individual limits of detection, but the big differences come again is in frequency or in moving from 0 to 1 day delay to 2 day delay of returning results. So I would suggest for if you're trying to plan a surveillance program, for example, put frequency, which is linked to cost first, and then turnaround time second, and then pay attention to the sensitivity of the assay. I think this is important for anyone going into public health to think about these different nuances. So to conclude, this virus has spread very quickly after emerging in late 2019, and of course the U.S. Felt had many blunders early on in this infection. But we now have gotten a lot of those fixed, and we see that virus testing can be a powerful tool for surveillance. And We have very good assays now that are used both for the virology and the antibody testing. And in general, like as I just finished off saying, the sensitivity of the test should be considered secondary to frequency and turnaround time in a surveillance program. These are some of the references that I referred to in this. And Thank you very much. Some of the contributors for the modeling section of this paper are Dan Larimore and Roy Parker in Colorado. James Hay was a postdoc in my laboratory, and Milan Tombe and Brian Wilder, who are at Harvard University. Thank you.